Hey there, it's Mattea. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bookends today. If you've been enjoying our show, it would be a huge help for us, and I think also for you, to follow us on your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever app you use to listen. This will ultimately help us make more Bookends episodes and connect you with more of your favorite authors. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks so much for listening. Hi, and welcome to Bookends. I'm Mattea Roach. Have you ever watched someone that you care about get themselves into some sort of sticky situation and then proceed to make that situation worse at every possible opportunity? Maybe you're cringing internally for this person. Maybe you really want to help or stop them from doing whatever they're doing, but you feel powerless. Maybe you get so frustrated that you just want to walk away. I went through all these stages of emotions while reading Daniel Aleman's new novel, I Might Be in Trouble. It's about a struggling writer who wakes up to find his date from the night before dead in his bed. This dark comedy is Daniel's first foray into adult fiction. He's previously written 2 novels for young adults. I Might Be in Trouble touches on themes of loneliness, isolation, and the lengths we can go to feel loved and emotionally connected in a fragmented world. It was very cool to have Daniel Aleman join me in the studio in Toronto. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for coming in.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start by talking about the main character of this novel, David Alvarez. He hooks up with this sexy stranger at the beginning of the novel who seems like the man of his dreams, if only for one night. But the next morning, that man is dead in David's bed. He is not going to be the man of anyone's dreams. I'm speaking kind of glibly because this plot is played for laughs, like Daniel is frantically trying to figure out what to do with a dead body in his condo. But there's also a real sense of anxiety and darkness to these proceedings. How did you balance humor and horror in crafting this story?
Well, from the start, I kind of thought of this as a comedy. Like, I wanted first and foremost to laugh, especially as I thought of certain experiences that I have faced as I enter adulthood. And I also wanted to play with genre. Like, for me, it was important to bring in elements of suspense, of a little bit of thriller. There's even like romance in this book. So it really is a little bit of everything, but the laughter is what brings it all together. I want us to, as you said, be cringing a little sometimes, be like telling David, oh my gosh, please don't do this, but also be firmly on his side and just feel all the emotions as we read.
I think there were a couple of people that I know in my life that I had in mind as I was reading this book, of people that I care for deeply who often make choices where I am baffled and don't understand why they're doing it. You mentioned that some of this story was inspired by experiences that you had in younger adulthood, and it does feel like there's a lot of you in this book. Mm-hmm. You know, David in the book is a writer who had some very big early career success. You're a writer who also had some pretty big early career successes. Both you and David are of Mexican heritage. David names a main character, Daniel, in one of his books. You have the same initials. I'm wondering how much of the fictional David does come from you, the real life Daniel?
So much. And I would say that with every single book I write, I seek to put pieces of myself in the main character. And with this one especially, I wanted to be very intentional about writing a mirror image of myself. As you said, we share the same initials, the same profession, a lot of the same challenges. I was 28 years old at the time of writing the first draft of this book, as is David. And for me, I use my fiction to understand myself better and to understand the world and certain experiences that I have. And the best way I have to sort of process everything is to be honest. And what better way to be honest and be authentic than to write a character that is, you know, me, except not me.
So in terms of David's role as a writer, because it did strike me that David in the book has written 2 books, one of which was successful, one of which less so. This is also your 3rd book in real life. Mm-hmm. David, the character, is struggling to work on his 3rd book throughout the novel as he's dealing with all of this, possible murder intrigue. David is really feeling the heat to write a bestseller and feels a lot of pressure as somebody who's kind of like a young ingenue. Is this sort of high pressure to match one's previous output something that you've felt in your career at all?
I constantly feel that pressure. I want every book I write to be better than the last. And it's not necessarily that anyone is, yelling at me being like, Daniel, come up with a best-selling novel. But I am yelling at myself to do that. And I am yelling at myself to do right by the readers who have supported me, and I want to put something special in their hands. And so I definitely feel that anxiety of I want to learn, I want to grow, I want to be better than I used to be. And I think that comes back to just all of us in one way or another as we look at our lives, as we look at our careers. We have this idea of success that we want to achieve. And sometimes that success feels just a little out of reach. That success feels different, perhaps, from what we once imagined it would be. And that is sort of what I bring to this character, that fear and that anxiety and that hope of reaching his own idea of the perfect career, the perfect life.
I'm curious, you're talking about this sort of anxiety and pressure that you put on yourself and wanting each book that you produce to be better than the last. It did strike me as interesting that after writing 2 young adult novels, you then pivoted to writing something that is a book for grown adults. A lot of people who are YA authors stick with writing young adult fiction for their whole career or for a lot longer in their career. I'm wondering what prompted you to turn to adult fiction and specifically to this kind of comedy with a tinge of horror at this point in your life?
I love writing for young adults. And young adult as a category has such a special place in my heart. But I think in the back of my mind, I had always wanted to write a book for grown-ups. And this one felt like the perfect way to introduce myself to a new audience because it contains so many pieces of my real life. And I also think that writing for adults has a way of allowing me to be more honest. It's so cathartic to be telling a story as I go through experiences that are similar to the characters. And it helps me, connect with audiences in a whole new way and be authentic in a completely new way.
I want to ask, it's you're talking a bit about authenticity in your adult fiction. I guess the implication then that there are certain topics that can't necessarily always be addressed in young adult fiction or that need to maybe be addressed with a different touch than when you're writing for adults. Did you feel ever when you were working in the young adult space that there were certain topics that you had to shy away from or that you were deliberately not writing about, keeping in mind the audience that you were trying to reach?
Not necessarily. I think that I am very also mindful of, the unfortunate reality that are book bans in this day and age. And when I was writing for young adults, especially, I think that was weighing on me, as it does on so many authors. But I think my first 2 books, I also aimed to be as honest as I could, especially as I dealt with difficult topics of immigration, of deportation. But there's something so different about this book in that I'm not necessarily writing about social topics, but I'm writing about the real life struggles that I go through. And that's more so what I mean when I think of this as my most honest book yet. It's a book that I've been so happy yet scared to share with my friends and my family. It has led to some interesting conversations, especially with my friend group, because I had a way of feeling lonely a few years ago, especially at the start of the pandemic. I felt so isolated from everyone. I felt like people were moving away, friendships were shifting, and I wasn't where I wanted to be with my career. My family felt far away. And suddenly I came up with this story idea. And as I start sharing it with people, I realized that I'm not as alone as I thought I was. The struggles that I face of loneliness, of feeling pressure to reach career success, of, wanting a perhaps better or closer relationship with family. These are things that so many of us go through and that we don't talk about enough. So I'm also happy about the way that this story has allowed me to open up to people in my life and has allowed them to open up in return. And I hope that it'll also allow readers to start those conversations with their friends.
David, it's David. See, I'm like, whoa, I'm getting David
this.
Daniel,
this
the
is like,
the meta.
I actually love how meta this book is because a lot of people call me David. A lot of people call the main character Daniel.
Yeah.
And this to me is just like, it's special, and that's almost what I want.
Yeah, it's like a deliberate play. Anyway, Daniel, I want to return to a lot of this stuff about loneliness, but first I want to delve maybe a little bit into your background and how you got to a place in adulthood where these were themes that you felt spoke to you and that you wanted to delve into. I know that you were born and raised in Mexico City, but you've also lived in New York, in Montreal, and now in Toronto. I'm wondering what those moves, that's a lot of moves for somebody who's relatively young to have had.
Yeah.
What made you, first of all, decide on Canada as a place that you wanted to be? And what perspective does that, having moved around, maybe give you on some of the themes that we've been talking about so far in this conversation?
I think that the experience of leaving my home country at a young age deeply marked so many aspects of my life, and certainly my fiction. I always say that it's tough as it is to be a teenager. You're asking yourself so many questions about identity, about how you view yourself, how you view the world. And then to add to that the layer of now you're in a new country and you're leaving all your friends and family and everyone behind, everything you know. And now you got to figure out who you are in this completely new context. And that was such a difficult experience for me to go through, especially as a gay teenager who was already coming out, who was already dealing with, lots of difficulties that come with that. And I found myself in the United States with my family, and I had that question of like, who is Daniel? Like, am I the American, quote unquote, American Daniel or the Mexican Daniel? And then it was time for me to go to university. And I looked at Montreal at McGill as a great option. I was very lucky to get an academic scholarship to attend McGill. So that's how I ended up in Canada, which was a fantastic opportunity, but added this entirely new challenge of starting over on my own, again, in a short amount of time in a new country. And that is why I think I keep coming back to these questions of belonging, of identity. And I struggle with that. I struggle to a degree to understand where I belong. Luckily now I'm so much happier. Toronto has become my home and I've developed amazing friendships here. But I think, on a certain level, even if you haven't immigrated, even if you've never left your hometown, all of us struggle to find a place where we belong. And so these questions of where we fit in hopefully will resonate with people regardless of their background.
Do you think this struggle to find a place where you belonged and a place where maybe different parts of your identity could exist together, is that part of what drew you to writing, do you think?
I was a writer way before that. I started telling stories when I was super young. When I must have been like 4 or 5. I couldn't actually write, but I could draw. And so I would make these little drawings and then tell my mom the story behind them. And I went on to write little short stories and then novels. And I think more so it was a blessing to have my writing as a outlet, as a support for me as I went through challenging experiences. The importance of my writing has increased as I look at, some of these challenges of loneliness, of questions surrounding belonging, of identity. I have turned to the page to answer them or to hopefully find answers to them.
Daniel, I want to return a little bit to the plot of I Might Be in Trouble. Basically, your main character, David, thinks that he's killed this man that he's hooked up with.
Yeah.
And the person that he calls in this moment of crisis is not a friend, not a family member. It's his literary agent, Stacy, who immediately rushes to his aid. And together they work out, not let's call 911 and see if we can clear David's name. They work out what are they going to do with the body. Baffling thing to do, in my view.
Yeah.
What was the inspiration for this dynamic of a young writer, his older sort of seasoned agent? It's kind of an unlikely duo to be thrown into this situation.
That is exactly what I wanted to explore. I wanted to explore an unlikely friendship. And the reason is that sometimes we find companionship and comfort in the most unexpected of places. Perhaps David, as a 28-year-old, would expect that he would be surrounded by friends his own age, and suddenly he realizes that he's alone, that his friendships have moved away, that he has broken up with his boyfriend who he's still in love with, and the only person remaining in his life is actually a professional connection. It's his agent. And I wanted to explore how he can open up to someone who's not meant to be there as his friend, but who still is willing to be. And there's such beauty in that. And the unlikelihood that a 60-year-old woman and a 28-year-old gay guy would become this close and share so much of their lives with each other. And I've also found friends that are not my age, and I've also found comfort in the most unexpected of places. So that's something that I was trying to get at with this.
Was there anyone in particular that inspired the character of Stacy? Because I think she is a very specific type of high-powered woman working in the media that I've encountered one or two of in my day, for sure.
There's no one person in particular, but I mean, I think of Catherine O'Hara as like, oh my gosh, she would be so perfect if ever there was a film adaptation for this story. I get asked a lot as well if this Stacey, this character, was inspired by my own agent. And I do want to say that she wasn't. I want to protect my agent from being asked questions about whether or not he has helped one of his authors move a dead body, which I promise you he hasn't. But there's also something to be said about that close relationship between an agent and an author.
I can definitely envision Catherine O'Hara doing a very good Stacy voice. Stacy has a very particular manner of speaking that I think Catherine O'Hara would do a fantastic work with. There's an interesting dynamic in I Might Be in Trouble where David, is on the lookout for kind of casual hookups, meets this person, Robert, who he feels, I could really see myself with this guy. This guy seems special. Mm-hmm. And then this is the guy that he hooks up with that ends up dying. Mm-hmm. He's then thrust into this situation where, first of all, he's almost grieving a relationship that he didn't get to have, right? This guy seemed perfect, and now the rug has been pulled out from under me just as soon as I met him. But he's also dealing with the fact that there are other people who knew and cared about this person, who actually had some sort of relationship with him, and they need to know what happened. He's also dealing with the fact that he didn't know this guy. And so he's maybe learning some things about this person that make him seem less perfect than he was on the surface. What is David going through emotionally in navigating all of this?
Everything that David goes through in those scenes comes from a very personal place, which was I was grieving, I don't want to call it a relationship, but a situationship. I met someone on a dating app, much as David does, back in 2019. And this went on for about 7 months. He didn't live in Toronto, so it was like a long distance situationship. We traveled back and forth a few times. And when the pandemic hit, I realized that this person was in fact engaged and had been lying to me this entire time, had been making me believe that he wanted a relationship, that he wanted a future with someone just like me. And when I learned the truth, I was obviously deeply hurt, and I turned to my writing to try to understand what had happened. And I feel like all of those emotions just come from such a personal place. You're grieving the person you thought you knew. You're grieving what you thought that relationship could have become. And you're also just reeling from the unexpected revelations about this person. So David goes through all of that, and it does come from from reality, a lot of it. Minus a dead body in the bed.
I think there's an element sometimes that people feel as well if they feel that they've been duped in a romantic relationship, or, you know, someone turns out to be different than who you thought this person was. There's not only that sense of grief, but also a sense of like self-flagellation of how could I have been so naive as to think that this situation could have really been as good as it seemed, or to think that if you're somebody who maybe struggles a bit with self-esteem, as I think David does through this book with his writing, with Whether He Deserves Love, how could I have been so stupid as to imagine that a fantastic person would actually be really interested in me? There has to be some sort of catch. I'm wondering, I guess, whether that is something that you were maybe working through in the aftermath of that situationship that you mentioned that didn't pan out.
Oh, absolutely. I felt so stupid. I felt like, how could I have not seen this before? How could I have trusted someone who told all these lies? And what I've come to understand, especially through the process of working on this book, is also that dating and relationships require vulnerability. And I can't be sorry for having been vulnerable. I can't be sorry that I chose to trust someone and chose to look at them, you know, at face value, what they were showing me and what they were telling me, because that is what's required if you seek to find a partner. And so there was definitely a lot of self-blame in this whole situation, but I've come to realize that the only person to blame was the person who was trying to deceive and trying to tell lies. And and this book really has helped me come to terms with all that. It has been almost like therapy.
I want to talk about another sort of loneliness and isolation that we see throughout the course of this book, which is sort of not family estrangement, because David and his father are on speaking terms, but I would say family disconnection perhaps would be the less extreme term. In I Might Be in Trouble, David's father has remarried after David's mother died. There's this stepmother figure that David doesn't particularly like, and I think he experiences as a bit of a wedge, perhaps, between him and his father. I'm wondering what you wanted to explore with this kind of family relationship where, again, there's not estrangement, there's not overt family homophobia, perhaps coming from David's father, but it seems like that's maybe going on a little bit under the surface, that there's this sense that David can't be totally himself around his family.
I think one of the things I wanted to explore was, contrary to what we were saying earlier about being able to find connection in unexpected places, it's this irony of being unable to find connection in the places where perhaps you should. And sometimes, especially as queer people, we can look at our family and be like, you know, we don't have an unsupportive family, but there's a little barrier there that we can't quite get past. And that was something that David goes through. Like, he, as you said, it's not that his dad actively is homophobic or anything, but there is a wedge that David doesn't know how to bridge. And so many of us go through that, I feel.
Yeah, it's a complex situation that I think a lot of readers who are queer people that have that kind of tense relationship with their family probably recognize. You know, being an immigrant family, there's often generational splits because the experience of being like a second generation, someone who's born in the US versus someone who immigrated, also sometimes very different. I want to return, I guess, to this kind of concept of writing about immigration and return to some of your young adult books, because we've been talking a lot about how I Might Be in Trouble was a way of writing through a lot of things that you experienced in your life. Your young adult work tackles stuff that also sounds quite personal, but is very different to anything that's in this book. So your first young adult book was called Indivisible and was about a teen named Mattea and his experience with being an immigrant in the United States. Your second novel, Brighter Than the Sun, was about a Mexican teen girl and her life going to school in the United States amidst some racial tension and threats of deportation. Both of these books obviously really get into what it means to be an immigrant, and a young immigrant particularly in the United States. What drove you to write young adult fiction about those particular experiences?
With each one of my books, I seek to understand myself better in the world. When I first started writing Indivisible, It was, I think, 2017. So there was a new administration in the White House that wasn't particularly immigration friendly or kind toward Mexican immigrants specifically. And that was very much on my mind. And through Indivisible, I also sought to understand myself as an immigrant and my own immigration story. To me, that book is about Mattea, who at one point in the book literally says, I just don't know how to reconcile the Mexican version of me and the American version of me. That was sort of the big question, the big personal question that I was exploring there. With Brighter Than the Sun, I also wanted to explore a teenager who is faced with adult responsibilities. I remember very vividly as a teenager just feeling like I was almost on the outside looking in. I felt like all of my peers were being teenagers, doing teenage things. And there I was asking myself these big questions about identity, struggling with coming out. And I felt like I was thrust into adulthood a little bit, in a harsh way. So that second book, that's what it's about for me. And throughout, I felt as someone who came from Mexico with his family as immigrants, I had a lot to say and I had a lot to hopefully bring to the table from a new perspective. I wanted to talk about immigration in a human way and not necessarily talk about it from a purely political or legal stance, which is what we're used to hearing. Like, we're talking about people's lives and people's identities. And I hope my books serve as some sort of reminder to the people who need these stories that they're allowed to exist and that they're not alone.
The notion of writing, being a writer, and as you're saying, like also being a reader, these are things that are so foundational to how people derive meaning from life. I think in a lot of cases, it certainly sounds throughout the conversation we've had that this has been a really meaningful practice for you from a very young age, the practice of storytelling and of representing yourself and people like you in stories. Outside of writing, what are some other things that have been kind of propping you up lately? Because it sounds like throughout this conversation, you've been describing a bit of a transformation in kind of coming out of loneliness and coming out of isolation as you go from your late 20s into your, 30s now.
I would say I've been lucky to find a wonderful support system in the past few years. And that is something that David, the main character, and I Might Be in Trouble longs for and doesn't have. And I feel sometimes I manifest certain things through my writing. I think that by writing about this character who wants so badly to be in a loving relationship, who wants so badly to have a great group of friends, I sort of manifested this. Like, I now have a great group of friends that is there for me, that I'm there for. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens after I write about it. I think processing certain things through my fiction allows me to change my mindset, allows me even to see the support that is available to me that sometimes I was too naive or blind to see. So that's why I think also, like, writing about my own life is therapeutic, because it really does open doors to me, real, very, very real doors for me.
I was about to ask, for people that are struggling and maybe feel isolated, what are your tips of how to emerge? And I guess manifesting through perhaps journaling seems to be the story. Any other hot tips of how to build community? I think particularly for folks that live in urban centers and maybe feel like it's difficult to meet their neighbors, difficult to get out and like take up hobbies or build community in any sort of organic way.
It's so hard to put yourself out there. It's so hard to strike up a conversation with a stranger. But ultimately, I've never regretted doing it. Even if it's embarrassing a little bit at the start, like, it helps just to put yourself out there as much as you can. And even if you can't, I think opening up your eyes to the support that's already there. And that support can take shape in so many different ways. It can take shape in a friendly neighbor that you run into in the elevator. It can take shape in a coworker. It can take shape in the form of someone you meet on a dating app. And especially when I was facing all of these feelings of loneliness and isolation, I found so much comfort in reading and watching TV shows and movies that reflected bits of my reality back to me. And it helped me understand the DNA of that loneliness that I was experiencing. And the more we understand ourselves, the better we can face our challenges head on. And also, I would say, like, it's not going to be like this forever. I know when you feel lonely, it has a way of feeling like that's all life is ever going to be, but it doesn't have to be. There is a life on the other side of loneliness.
That feels like a beautiful sentiment to wrap things up on. Daniel, thank you so much for coming in and chatting with me today. It's been such a joy to dive into the chaotic world of this novel with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Daniel Aleman, and his novel is called I Might Be in Trouble. This episode was produced by Ryan B. Patrick with help from Ailey Yamamoto. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our audio tech, Aronde Williams, and the rest of the CBC Books team. They are sensational, and that is my word, not theirs. If you liked this interview, you might also enjoy my conversation with the American writer Rumaan Alam. Here's a sneak peek. Was this idea of tying wealth to moral desert something that you were interested in and thinking about while putting this together?
I think that people would be discomfited to realize the extent to which they believe that there is some relationship between the possession of wealth and the possession of sort of moral standing. When you see, as you do in any metropolitan area in this hemisphere probably, people in crisis, real crisis, sleeping on the train, in the subway station, to survive that kind of experience, the rest of us kind of tune it out. We sort of filter it out of our reality. We don't quite see it. Most of us want to believe, and probably do believe, or feel empathy. Oh, this person has a disease. They have had a hard go at life, and I feel for them. Maybe I will even feel enough for them to give them $5. Beneath that, I do think there is a very ugly idea that is baked into us from the time we are very small, that somehow if you have ended up on the streets, there is some moral failing. It's just so connected to the American idea of the person.
You can check out the rest of that conversation through the link in the description. And make sure to hit the follow button in your podcast player so you don't miss any of the amazing guests we have coming up on the show. Of course, you can also always tune into Bookends on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.